This module will introduce conflict assessment as the essential first step in dispute resolution. When there are many parties involved in a complex public dispute, a public institution or person considering a consensus-building process must determine whether there is a reasonable potential for successful consensus building. To assess the potential, the convener needs a lot of information on who the stakeholders are and whether they are willing to participate, how to frame the agenda, how many meetings to hold, by when a decision to be made, and so on. The primary goal of conflict assessment is to get such information so that assessor can suggest whether or not it makes sense to go forward with a consensus building process, and if so, how the process ought to be structured. This module will explain the procedure of conflict assessment in detail and explore the benefits of this procedural tool. A conflict assessment starts when a convener, usually a person in a public institution, asks an assessor or a team of assessors to conduct an assessment. In this first step, the assessor gathers preliminary information about the conflict and prepares to interview stakeholders. The assessor should be perceived as neutral in the eyes of key stakeholders when it comes to controversial issues in order to get their frank feedbacks in interviews. Also, the assessor must work independently. The assessor should keep confidential interview statements confidential from the convener, and the convener should not influence the assessor's recommendation later. When the assessor collects background information on the conflict, the convener can provide a preliminary list of key stakeholders, the history of the conflict, and the controversial issues. Then, the assessor drafts a letter of introduction to potential interviewees that explains the purpose of interview, introduces the assessor, describes the assessment process, promises confidentiality, and asks their participation in the interview. The assessor sends the letter of introduction to the stakeholders on the preliminary list first, and then calls each person to explain once again all the contents in the letter, to schedule an interview, and to ask them to suggest others who might be stakeholders in the conflict. The additional names of the individuals can be thought of as second circle of stakeholders to ensure that all possible interests are included. Then, the assessor prepares a list of interview questions that ask, what happens? What issues are important to you and why? What are the interests and concerns of other stakeholders? Would you be willing to participate in a consensus-building process designed to address this situation? The second step of conflict assessment is to gather information through face-to-face interviews following the prepared interview questions. The assessor should interview stakeholders in person to get accurate and candid information and build rapport and trust. In general, interviews should not last much more than 30 minutes each. It will be better to interview the most important stakeholders toward the end in order to enrich the questions to be asked of the key actors. A written summary of the highlights of the interview should be sent to each participant again to ensure that interviewees' opinions has been captured appropriately and nothing has been misunderstood. After conducting interviews, the assessor can summarize the findings on the concerns and interests of stakeholders in the written document. To secure confidentiality, the findings can be organized by stakeholder categories, such as government, resident, industries, and civic organizations, without attribution to individuals or their organizations. Then, the assessor can map the areas of agreement and disagreement by using a matrix, where the issues are listed on one axis and the stakeholder groups are on the other axis. The matrix can show which issue is a primary concern for a specific stakeholder group and also indicate the relative priority of the issue to the group. Using a matrix, the assessor can indicate possibilities for mutual gain by finding potential trade between the different priorities of the issues perceived by stakeholder groups. Also, the assessor may identify potential obstacles to building consensus. For example, one or more key stakeholders refuses to participate, or huge power imbalances exist among the stakeholders, or deadline for the process is unrealistic. Based on an analysis of disagreement, the assessor can determine whether or not a consensus-building process can proceed. If just one of such difficult conditions exists, the assessor may recommend appropriate ways to overcome such a challenge. For example, if a key stakeholder refuses to participate, the assessor may suggest that other stakeholders with similar views be invited to participate instead. If the assessor believes a consensus process is feasible, the next step is to recommend a preliminary process design in the conflict assessment report. The final process design should be determined by stakeholders after they review the draft assessment and discuss at the first meeting of a consensus building process so that they could sense the ownership of the process. Process design includes the specific goals of the consensus building process, the agenda, and the order of issues to be discussed, the range of the stakeholder representatives, the time frame and schedule for meetings, and ground rules. The ground rules address important issues that govern the dialogue. For example, how group decisions will be made, the roles and responsibilities of participants, the mediator, the convener, and the public, how participants should interact with each other, how media will be addressed, and how working groups will be utilized. The conflict assessment report can serve as a springboard to convening for a consensus building process. To do that, the assessor should circulate the final draft of the assessment report to all interviewees and the convener and ask their comments on both the description of stakeholder interest and on the proposed process design. After this consultation, the assessor can revise the draft and produce a final assessment report. If all the stakeholders agree to the recommendations of the final report, they can participate in the first meeting of stakeholders to approve the proposed design and start consensus building process. Considering the steps of conflict assessment, it may take more than 3 to 4 months to issue a final assessment document. Conflict assessment also requires lots of commitment, energy, and monetary cost. Despite the cost, conflict assessment has more benefits for all the parties involved in a public dispute. For the disputant, conflict assessment offers an opportunity to clarify their own interests and concerns and understand those of other stakeholders, although they did not meet each other. Also, by reviewing proposed process design, they can negotiate strategic issues regarding the structure of the process before they decide to start the process. In doing so, they can reduce potential disputes about the procedural issues later. For the convener, conflict assessment can save unnecessary effort to building consensus when consensus building is not feasible. However, when it is feasible, the convener can identify appropriate consensus building process and motivate stakeholders to participate in the process. Also, for the assessor, conflict assessment gives an opportunity to build trust and foster good relationships with the stakeholders so that he or she can work as a facilitator or a mediator in the consensus building process in the future. Now let's review the module for conflict assessment. The goal of conflict assessment is to get necessary information to determine whether or not it makes sense to go forward with a consensus building process and if so, how the process ought to be structured. Despite each cost, conflict assessment has lots of benefits for all the parties involved in a public dispute.